How far would you go for your child? Would you work yourself to exhaustion, sacrificing your own happiness just to make sure they had everything they ever wanted? That's exactly what Monique Russell did. She gave her son a life of luxury, no limits, no struggles, no consequences. But when she finally said enough, he didn't just rebel. He plotted her murder. Her crime. Cutting his allowance. His solution. Hiring a classmate for $400 to kill her. He thought he'd be rich. Instead, he ended up in handcuffs. Raising a child is a delicate balance, too little, and they struggle, too much, and they never learn gratitude. Monique Russell thought she was giving her son the life she never had. She worked late nights, skipped vacations, and poured every dollar into making sure he never felt the struggle she once did. But in shielding him from hardship, she unknowingly built something far worse: entitlement. Welcome to Monique Russell had spent her entire life working toward stability. Raised by a single mother in a cramped two-bedroom apartment in Atlanta, Georgia, she knew what it meant to struggle. Her childhood was a cycle of sacrifice: hand-me-down clothes, cold dinners when bills piled up, and watching her mother work herself to exhaustion just to keep the lights on. Money was always tight, and luxuries were nothing more than a fantasy. The lessons of scarcity were drilled into her young mind, but instead of hardening her, they shaped her into a woman determined to never let her own child experience the same hardships. At 21, Monique found herself standing in front of a bathroom mirror, staring at two pink lines on a pregnancy test. The father was nothing more than a fleeting romance, someone she thought had the potential to be something real, until reality proved otherwise. When she told him about the pregnancy, his response was predictable: denial, excuses, and finally, silence. By the time she was 6 months pregnant, he was gone: no calls, no messages, no support. It was just her and the life growing inside her. George was born on March 14, 2006, and from the moment she held him, Monique swore he would never know what it felt like to go without. She worked tirelessly, first as a junior accountant, then climbing her way up the corporate ladder to a more comfortable salary. She took on extra hours, picked up freelance work, and saved every penny to provide a life she had only dreamed of as a child. By the time George was in middle school, they were living in a spacious townhouse in a quiet Atlanta suburb. And Monique never said no. But money, when given without discipline, can create something dangerous. At 17, George Russell wasn't just another high school senior, he was the high school senior. While other kids saved up lunch money for a pair of sneakers, he already had the latest designer drops the moment they hit the shelves. His closet looked like a high-end boutique, filled with Balenciaga hoodies, Gucci belts, and Jordan releases that some of his classmates could only dream of owning. He didn't just dress the part, he lived it. George didn't take the bus or catch rides with friends. He pulled up to school every morning in his mother's black BMW X5, blasting music, sunglasses on, barely acknowledging the students who watched him in envy. Teachers knew him, but not for his academic achievements. His grades were barely passing, but his attitude stood out more than any test score. George had a way of making everyone feel beneath him. He didn't ask for things, he expected them. Whether it was a hall pass, a second chance on an assignment, or an extension on a project, he demanded it with the same entitled confidence he used to order bottle service at the parties he frequented. His reputation at Brookwood High School was legendary, not for being the smartest, but for being the guy who had it all. And nothing boosted his ego more than the attention of girls. Dating one girl at a time. That wasn't George's style. He had options, and he made sure everyone knew it. At any given time, he was juggling 2, maybe 3 girlfriends, each convinced she was his main priority. They loved him for the gifts, The shopping sprees at Lenox Mall, the dinners at expensive steakhouses, and the wads of cash he handed them just to have fun. But the money that fueled his lifestyle wasn't infinite. And the more he spent, the more reckless he became. Monique had spent 17 years sacrificing for her son, but April 2024 was the month she finally hit her breaking point. For years, she had convinced herself that George would mature, that one day he'd appreciate all she had done for him. She had ignored the way he blew through money like it was endless. She had made excuses when teachers reached out about his slipping grades. But that morning, when she checked her bank statements and saw that over $7,000 had vanished in just weeks, something inside her snapped. That night, she sat in the living room, waiting for him. The house was silent, except for the steady ticking of the kitchen clock. She checked her phone. 1:28 a.m. He wasn't answering her calls or texts. Finally, at 1:30 a.m. sharp, she heard the front door creak open. The scent of strong cologne and stale alcohol filled the air before she even saw him. His clothes were slightly wrinkled, and his eyes were bloodshot, but he moved with that same arrogant swagger, acting as if nothing was wrong. She stood as he stepped inside. "Where have you been?" she asked, her voice low. George barely looked up from his phone. "Out." "Out where?" He shrugged. "Just out." Monique clenched her jaw. "Sit down. We need to talk." He let out an exaggerated sigh, rolling his eyes before dropping onto the couch, slouching like he couldn't care less. His fingers tapped against the phone screen, completely disinterested. "This can't keep happening, George." "What can't?" He didn't even bother looking at her. "The spending. The partying. The way you treat me like I'm a damn ATM." George scoffed. "Ma, you act like you can't afford it." That was it. The final straw. She had worked herself to exhaustion for this boy, overtime shifts, sleepless nights, years of self-sacrifice just to make sure he had everything. And this was how he saw her. As a walking wallet. She exhaled sharply and sat forward, her eyes sharp. "I'm done." His fingers froze on the screen. "Done with what?" She didn't hesitate. "Your allowance is being cut. From now on, you'll get $200 a month. That's it." George's head snapped up. "What?" "I'll still take care of everything you need, your food, your clothes, your school supplies. But this reckless spending is over." His jaw clenched. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious." His nostrils flared. His fingers gripped his phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. "That's not fair." Monique didn't flinch. "Fair? You think life is fair? I worked for everything I have. I will not keep watching you throw money away like it grows on trees." George shot up from the couch, his chest heaving. "You're trying to ruin my life." She stood too, refusing to back down. "And one more thing, if you don't shape up, I'll send you to live with your grandmother in Augusta. Maybe some discipline will do you some good." George froze. His grandmother's house. Augusta. He could already imagine it, no parties, no spending money, no friends. Just strict rules and no freedom. "You wouldn't," he muttered. Monique crossed her arms. "Try me." She went to bed that night feeling drained but convinced she was doing the right thing. She thought he'd be mad for a few days, then move on. She was wrong. The next morning, George was a nightmare. He stomped through the house, banging cabinets, slamming doors, acting like a spoiled child throwing a tantrum. He refused to answer when she spoke to him. He didn't clean up after himself. He blasted his music too loud and acted rude and dismissive. By lunchtime, Monique had had enough. She stormed into the living room, standing between him and the blaring TV. "You're not gonna walk around this house with a damn attitude all day." He sucked his teeth. Then give me my money back. She shook her head. You still don't get it, do you? He didn't say anything, just glared at her, his arms crossed over his chest. Monique exhaled and sat down, lowering her voice. I need you to understand something, George. Everything I've ever done has been for you. But I can't keep rewarding bad behavior. You need to grow up. George stared at her blankly. She rubbed her temples. You know I have a $2.1 million life insurance policy, right? She reached for her purse, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and slid it across the table. George stared at it, then at her. Go ahead. Read it. Slowly, he picked it up, unfolding the document. As his eyes scanned the words, his expression changed. At the top, it read. Life insurance policy, beneficiary designation. His eyes flickered across the numbers, and that's when he saw it. $2,100,000. A lump formed in his throat. Monique leaned forward. You're my only child, so naturally, you're the beneficiary. But let me make one thing clear, that is not guaranteed. His eyes darted up to hers. What do you mean? I mean, if you don't start changing, I will take you off this policy so fast it'll make your head spin. George sat frozen. I'm giving you this warning now, she continued. If I see any more disrespect, any more recklessness, I will call my insurance agent tomorrow and have that beneficiary changed. Do you hear me? George nodded slowly, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. $2.1 million. That was his money. That was his inheritance. That was his future. Unless. No. He pushed the thought away. But as the days passed, it kept creeping back in. The idea whispered to him, growing louder and louder. If she was gone, none of this would be a problem. There would be no more fights. No more lectures. No more cutting off his money. Without her, he would have everything. It was such a simple solution. But George was oblivious to one very crucial fact. Even if his mother died, he wouldn't get a dime. He was still a minor, only 17 years old. That money wouldn't be handed to him outright. It would be locked away until he turned 18, and it would require adult supervision to be accessed. But in his arrogance, he never even considered that possibility. All he could see was dollar signs. And once the thought had taken root in his mind, there was no turning back. She was threatening to take it away. She was threatening to cut him off completely. And in his twisted mind, that meant one thing, he was running out of time. By that evening, he had convinced himself there was only one way to fix this. At school the next day, George watched Derek "D-Rock" Johnson from across the lunchroom. He was an easy target, broke, desperate, always looking for a way to fit in. George waited until they were in the hallway before approaching him. His voice was low. His words were sharp. I got a job for you. Derek smirked. A job? $400. Cash. Derek raised an eyebrow. For what? George looked him dead in the eye. I need you to kill my mom. Derek's face froze. He waited for the punchline. But George wasn't joking. He laid it out like a business deal. He explained that Monique had a $2.1 million life insurance policy, that she was about to cut him off. If she was gone, he'd get everything. Derek hesitated. I don't know, man, he muttered. George leaned in closer, his voice a low whisper. $400, D. That's new clothes, new kicks. That's a fresh start. Derek thought about it. That money would change everything for him. He could finally stop feeling like the broke kid. He could finally be somebody. All right, Derek finally said. I'm in. The plan was simple. Derek would stage a fake home invasion. He would wear a mask, break in through the back door, and shoot Monique. Then he would take a few items to make it look like a robbery before disappearing into the night. The date was set, May 14, 2024, at 10:45 p.m. As George walked away that afternoon, a twisted sense of relief washed over him. It was done. By this time next month, he'd be a millionaire. May 14, 2024, 10:30 p.m. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the television. Monique sat on the couch, half watching some crime show while absent-mindedly scrolling through her phone. She had been exhausted all day, the weight of the past few weeks dragging on her. The fight with George, his attitude, the stress of trying to make him see reason, it all sat heavy on her shoulders. She sighed and checked the time. 10:30 p.m. She needed to go to bed soon. Across the house, George sat in his room, gripping his phone so tightly his fingers ached. His leg bounced anxiously as he stared at the text thread with Derek. "George, you ready?" Derek, "Yeah." "You sure she up?" George, "She in the living room. The back door's unlocked." Derek, "Bet." 10:45. George swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had thought this moment would feel exciting. Like he was finally getting rid of the one thing standing in his way. But now that it was here, his chest felt tight. There was no turning back. 10:44 p.m. Derek stood outside in the darkness, wearing all black, a mask pulled over his face. His heart pounded as he clutched the cold metal of the gun George had given him earlier. He had never done anything like this before. But $400 was $400. Taking a slow breath, he reached for the back door handle. Just like George promised, it was unlocked. He slipped inside, careful to move quietly. But Monique had always been a light sleeper. She wasn't asleep now, but years of being a mother had given her instincts she couldn't ignore. As soon as the faintest creak echoed from the back of the house, she froze. Her eyebrows knitted together. Had she imagined that? She reached for the remote and turned the volume down. Silence. Then, another sound. A soft shuffle, like someone stepping carefully over the hardwood floor. Her stomach clenched. "George," she called out, sitting up straighter. No answer. Her pulse quickened. She set her phone down and stood up slowly, her bare feet padding quietly against the floor. As she moved toward the hallway, the house felt too still. Too wrong. Then, she saw it. A shadow. For a fraction of a second, she barely had time to register the figure in black stepping out from the darkness. Her lips parted. Her breath caught in her throat. Then, boom. A gunshot shattered the silence. The impact slammed into her chest, and the force of it sent her staggering backward. A burning pain exploded through her body. She gasped, her knees buckling as the world tilted. Her body hit the floor hard. She tried to breathe, but her lungs weren't working right. Something wet pooled beneath her, soaking her clothes, spreading across the cold tile. Her hands pressed against the wound, warm blood spilling through her fingers. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She could barely move. Could barely think. Her vision blurred. And then, she saw him. Standing in the hallway. George. His eyes were wide, his face pale. But he didn't move. She tried to speak, but the pain was too much. Her body felt too heavy. Somewhere in the distance, she heard footsteps running. A door slamming. Then, silence. George rushed forward, dropping to his knees beside her. He forced himself to look at her, but the sight made his stomach twist. Blood. So much blood. "Mom," he choked out, his voice shaking. She blinked slowly, her lips trembling, but no words came out. Her breathing was shallow now, weaker. And then, her eyes flickered. And closed. George sat there, frozen, his mind racing. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Derek was supposed to take his time, make it look like a real robbery. Not just shoot her and run. He forced himself to breathe. Think. He had to make this look real. His hands shook as he grabbed his phone and dialed 911. The moment the operator answered, he put on his best act. "Help," he screamed, his voice high-pitched with panic. Someone broke in. They shot my mom. Please, please, send someone." Tears welled in his eyes, and he let his breath come out ragged, just like he had practiced. She's not moving. Oh my God. Please hurry." The operator's voice was calm. "Stay on the line with me. Where is the shooter now?" I don't know." He ran out the back door. His heart hammered. He clutched his phone tightly, waiting, listening. Then, sirens. Loud. Getting closer. George forced himself to sob harder. The police would be here any second. And all he had to do now, was play the grieving son. May 14, 2024, 11:05 p.m. The flashing red and blue lights cut through the darkness, reflecting off the windows of the quiet suburban neighborhood. The wailing sirens had drawn the attention of several neighbors, who peeked through blinds and cracked open doors, whispering among themselves. 2 police cruisers pulled up in front of the house, and officers rushed toward the scene. The 911 call had been frantic, a terrified teenager claiming that an intruder had broken in and shot his mother. The dispatcher had told them that the caller was still inside, and that his mother wasn't responding. Officer Marcus Bennett was the first through the door, his hand hovering near his holster as he stepped inside. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood. And then, he saw her. Monique Russell lay sprawled across the living room floor, her body still, her clothes soaked through with deep red. Her eyes were closed, her face eerily peaceful despite the gunshot wound to her chest. A dark pool of blood had formed beneath her, congealing against the cold tiles. She was gone. Nearby, huddled against the couch, was George. The 17-year-old was trembling, his face buried in his hands, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked up at the officer with wide, red-rimmed eyes. Oh my God," he sobbed, rocking slightly. She's dead, he shot her, oh my God." Officer Bennett approached cautiously. "Son, I need you to take a deep breath. Tell me what happened." George sniffled hard, wiping his face with the sleeve of his designer hoodie. "I was in my room. I heard a noise, and then I heard the gunshot. I ran out and," he choked on his words, shaking his head violently. "She was on the floor, and the guy, he ran out the back door. I was too scared to do anything." Bennett studied him carefully. The kid looked shaken, but something about his reaction felt off. His hands trembled, but there were no real tears in his eyes. And his body language, it looked rehearsed. The officer's instincts told him there was more to this story. Meanwhile, other officers swept through the house. Nothing was stolen. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no kicked-in doors. Whoever had done this, had been let in. That was the first red flag. Detectives arrived and quickly started going through the home's security cameras. Monique had an advanced system, cameras at every entrance, a motion-activated camera in the hallway, and even a small one in the living room. And that was when they saw him. Clear as day. Derek "D-Rock" Johnson. A 17-year-old boy in all black, his face briefly exposed as he pulled down his mask too soon while running out of the house. It was a direct match. The detectives didn't need any more confirmation. They had their suspect. May 15, 2024, 9 a.m. Less than 10 hours later, officers stormed into Derek Johnson's house. The teen had been asleep, completely unaware that his face was already plastered across a police investigation. He barely had time to react before he was dragged out of bed, handcuffed, and shoved into the back of a squad car. Inside the interrogation room, Derek wasn't tough for long. At first, he tried to lie. Claimed he didn't know what they were talking about. But the moment they mentioned the security footage, his whole demeanor shifted. He panicked. His legs bounced under the table, his hands gripped the edge of the chair. And when the detective leaned in and said, "We already know everything. We just want to hear it from you," the pressure was too much. Derek spilled everything. Told them how George had planned it all. How he had promised him $400 to make it look like a home invasion. How he didn't mean to kill her that fast, but he panicked when she saw him. By noon, George Russell was in handcuffs too. May 15, 2024, 12 p.m. George had just woken up when he heard the pounding on the front door. Within seconds, the house was swarming with officers. Before he could even process what was happening, he was being shoved against the wall, his arms yanked behind his back. "You're under arrest for the murder of Monique Russell." His mouth went dry. His heart slammed against his ribs. No. No, this wasn't supposed to happen. He had played his role perfectly. He had cried. He had made them believe. Had he? As they dragged him toward the police cruiser, his mind raced. But then, an officer said something that made his entire body go cold. "Derek already told us everything." George's breath hitched. His stomach dropped. He snapped his head toward them, his eyes wild with panic. "What? No, he's lying, he." But the officer wasn't listening. Because it was too late. George Russell's fate was already sealed. The trial of George Russell and Derek "D-Rock" Johnson was one of the most swift and damning cases the state had seen in years. Prosecutors had everything: text messages, confessions, security footage. There was no reasonable doubt to be found. By the time September 2024 rolled around and the trial officially began, George still refused to believe he could lose. He sat in that courtroom with his chin high, dressed in a stiff, oversized suit, still acting like he was better than the people judging him. His plan? Blame everything on Derek. His defense attorneys painted him as an innocent kid who had been manipulated by the wrong crowd. They claimed he had no idea Derek was actually going to kill Monique, that he had simply made an offhand comment about his mother being a problem, and Derek had taken it too far. But there was just one problem. Derek had already confessed. And not just in private, he had testified against George in open court. When Derek took the stand, he didn't hesitate. His voice was steady as he recounted the truth. "George came to me with the plan. He said his mom had a $2.1 million policy, and that if she was gone, he'd be set for life. He promised me $400 to do it. Said it was just a simple job." George stiffened in his seat, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like his teeth might crack. He shot daggers at Derek, but the damage was done. Then, the final nail in the coffin, the text messages. Prosecutors showed the jury every message between the two. There was no denying the evidence. By the time the prosecution rested their case, the jury had already made up their minds. After just 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Guilty. Both George and Derek were convicted of first-degree murder. But sentencing? That was a different story. The court acknowledged that Derek had cooperated fully. He had turned himself in, confessed, and testified against George. Because of that, the judge showed some leniency. Derek was sentenced to 35 years in prison. With good behavior, he would be eligible for parole in 20 years. George, on the other hand. The judge had no mercy. She looked him straight in the eyes as she delivered his fate. "Mr. Russell, you planned the cold-blooded execution of your own mother, the woman who raised you, because you thought you deserved an easy life. You murdered her over money you weren't even entitled to yet. And you did it for a mere $400. There is no excuse. No justification. You are a danger to society, and you will never walk free again. Then came the hammer blow. I hereby sentence you to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. The moment those words hit, George's entire demeanor shattered. His shoulders sank. His mouth fell open. And for the first time since his arrest, he cried. Not for his mother. Not for the life he took. But for himself. All the arrogance, all the entitlement, all the belief that he could outsmart the system, it was gone. Now, he was just a 17-year-old boy who had thrown everything away. For nothing. Monique loved her son more than herself, and in the end, it cost her everything. She never imagined that the child she raised, the boy she held in her arms as a baby, would turn on her so cruelly. All she wanted was for him to be responsible, hardworking, and grateful. She thought cutting his allowance and teaching him the value of money would help him grow up. Instead, it made him see her as an obstacle. Not a mother, not the woman who loved him most in the world, just someone standing in his way. At 17 years old, George truly believed that money was worth more than his mother's life. He thought that without her, he'd be rich and free. But the reality? He'll never touch a single dollar of that $2.1 million inheritance. Instead of luxury cars and VIP parties, he'll spend the rest of his life in a prison cell. He gave up everything for nothing. If you were Monique, would you have raised George differently? Do you think she spoiled him too much, or was this outcome unavoidable? Let's discuss in the comments. If this case shocked you, make sure to like and subscribe to True Crime Explained.